Imagine a world where the horizon isn't a limit, but a question. 5 centuries ago, in the golden hills of Tuscany, a boy stood on a rocky outcrop, watching a red-tailed hawk circle in the thermals. Most people in the 15th century saw a bird and thought of dinner, or perhaps a divine omen. But this boy, Leonardo, saw something else. He saw the invisible. He saw the way the air curled over the leading edge of the wing. He saw the tension in the tendons, the mechanical pivot of the bone, and the silent, rhythmic heartbeat of nature's engineering. In that moment, he wasn't just looking at a bird, he was looking at a blueprint. But the world Leonardo was born into didn't care about his visions. To the elite of Italy, Leonardo was a mistake. He was the illegitimate son of a successful notary and a peasant girl, a bastard. In the rigid hierarchy of the Renaissance, this was a shadow that should have darkened his entire life. Because of his birth, the prestigious guilds were closed to him. He was barred from becoming a man of the law like his father. He was denied a formal education in Latin and higher mathematics, the must-haves for any intellectual of the day. He was, in his own words, an homo senza lettere, an unlettered man. But this rejection was the world's greatest accident. Because Leonardo couldn't learn from ancient, dusty books, he was forced to learn from the only teacher that never lies: reality. He didn't read about the flow of water. He sat for hours by the Arno River, sketching the way a single pebble could turn a calm stream into a chaotic vortex. He didn't study the anatomy of plants from a scroll. He felt the pulse of the sap in the stem. His struggle was a quiet, internal one. He was a boy who wanted to know everything. But he was an outsider in a world that demanded he know his place. At 14, his father noticed his uncanny talent for drawing and sent him to the pulsing heart of the Renaissance: Florence. He was apprenticed to Andrea del Verrocchio, the greatest master of the city. Florence was a sensory overload: the smell of linseed oil and crushed pigments, the clatter of hammers on marble, the intense heat of the bronze furnaces. Verrocchio was a giant, but Leonardo was a hurricane. The turning point came when Verrocchio asked his young apprentice to paint a single angel in a massive commission called The Baptism of Christ. Leonardo didn't just paint a figure. He used a new, experimental medium, oil, to create a being that seemed to breathe. The angel had skin that looked soft to the touch, hair that seemed to catch a breeze no one else could feel, and eyes that held a haunting, liquid intelligence. Legend says that when Verrocchio saw what his student had done, he looked at his own brush, then back at Leonardo's angel, and realized the student had surpassed the master so completely that he vowed never to paint again. But just as Leonardo's star began to rise, the world struck back. In the middle of the night, an anonymous note was dropped into a wooden box, known as the tamburo. It accused Leonardo and several others of sodomy, a crime that, in the 1470s, carried the penalty of death at the stake. Suddenly, the brilliant young artist was no longer a rising star. He was a hunted man. He was thrown into a dark, cold cell, facing a public trial that could end his life before he had even begun to show the world what he was capable of. The psychological toll was devastating. For a man who obsessed over the light and the beauty of the human form, to be shoved into the damp, lightless belly of a Florentine prison was a living death. He sat in the silence, waiting for a verdict, wondering if the bastard of Vinci would end as a footnote of scandal rather than a legend of genius. The charges were eventually dropped for lack of evidence, but the scar remained. The Florentine elite had looked at him with judgment. They saw a man who was too strange, too beautiful, and too distracted by 1,000 different ideas to ever be reliable. Leonardo emerged from that cell with a cold realization. Florence was a jewel, yes, but it was also a cage of tradition and gossip. He began to feel a restless, burning hunger for a place where his mind wouldn't just be tolerated, but unleashed. He began to realize that if he wanted to build the future, he had to leave the past behind. He looked north, toward Milan, and toward a man who didn't care about angels or altarpieces. He looked toward a warlord who needed machines of death. And Leonardo, the man who loved life, was about to offer him the most terrifying inventions the world had ever imagined. In 1482, he sat down and wrote what would become the most audacious job application in human history. Addressed it to Ludovico Sforza, the dark, ambitious Duke of Milan. In 10 carefully numbered paragraphs, Leonardo laid out a vision of himself that the world had never seen. He didn't lead with his ability to paint a soft smile or a divine angel. Instead, he promised Ludovico terrifying machines of war, portable bridges, armored tanks, secret tunnels, and cannons that would rain stones like a storm. Only in the final paragraph, almost as an afterthought, did he mention, "In painting, I can do as much as anyone else." He arrived in Milan not as a humble artist, but as a visionary engineer. Carrying a silver lyre, he had fashioned himself in the shape of a horse's skull. It was a statement. He was telling the Duke and the world that he was a man who could harmonize the beautiful with the macabre. The Milan years were Leonardo's true awakening. The Sforza court was a place of high drama and cold steel, and Leonardo became its resident wizard. He was the man who designed the elaborate stage sets for royal weddings, the man who invented the first automated scenery, and the man who fixed the city's complex canal systems. But while the Duke saw a brilliant courtier, Leonardo was leading a double life. By day, he walked the halls of power. By night, he retreated into the shadows of the hospital morgues. Imagine the scene. A small, windowless room lit by a single guttering candle. The smell of vinegar and rotting flesh is thick enough to choke a man. There, Leonardo stands alone, his sleeves rolled up, a silver blade in his hand. He isn't committing a crime. He is searching for the source of life. He peels back layers of skin, muscle, and fascia with a surgeon's precision. He is the first human being to truly see the valves of the heart, the intricate wiring of the nervous system, and the way a child sits in the womb. He was looking for the soul. He believed that if he could map every nerve and every bone, he could understand the very machinery of God. These were not just drawings. They were the first true maps of the human interior, hundreds of years before the invention of the X-ray. This obsession with the inner workings led to his first world-shattering masterpiece, The Last Supper. When Ludovico commissioned Leonardo to paint the scene in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie, the monks expected a traditional, static image of holy men sitting at a table. What they got was a psychological explosion. Leonardo spent weeks standing on the scaffolding, staring at the blank wall for hours without making a single stroke. He was searching for the exact moment of human reaction. The second after Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." He walked the streets of Milan, searching for faces. He looked for the face of betrayal for Judas, the face of shock for Peter, the face of grief for John. When he finally laid the pigment onto the wall, he didn't paint a religious icon. He painted a human crisis. He captured the way a hand clenches a knife, the way a shoulder slumps in denial, the way a face pales in the light. He had cracked the code of human emotion, translating the motions of the mind into the tension of a muscle. The city was breathless. Leonardo was no longer the unlettered man. He was the sun around which the intellectual world of Milan orbited. The climax of his Milanese success was the Gran Cavallo, the great horse. Ludovico wanted the largest bronze statue in the world, a 24-foot monument to his father. For nearly a decade, Leonardo obsessed over it. He studied the anatomy of stallions until he knew every vein. He designed a revolutionary casting method that required a single, massive pour of 70 tons of bronze. In 1493, a full-scale clay model was unveiled to the public. It was a marvel. People traveled from across Italy just to see the sheer power of the beast Leonardo had conjured from the earth. He was at the absolute peak of his powers. He had conquered anatomy, redefined painting, and was about to create the greatest sculpture of the age. But Leonardo's greatest tragedy was that he lived in a world of men, and men are defined by their greed and their wars. Just as the bronze was being gathered for the great horse, a dark cloud appeared on the horizon. The French army was marching across the Alps, and the metal Leonardo needed to immortalize his genius was suddenly needed for something else. The 70 tons of bronze were sent to the foundries to be turned into cannons. Leonardo watched in silence as his dream of the Gran Cavallo began to crumble. The French soldiers didn't just take Milan, they took Leonardo's soul. In a fit of bored cruelty, the invading archers used his masterpiece, the clay model of the great horse, for target practice. He watched from the shadows as the dream he had spent 10 years building was reduced to a pile of scarred, unrecognizable mud. He was nearly 50 years old, a man with a world-famous name, but no home, no patron, and a growing, poisonous reputation. To the rulers of Italy, Leonardo had become a brilliant failure. He was the genius who promised the moon, but delivered a handful of sketches. He was the man who had let the most important commissions of his life rot on the vine because he was too busy chasing the flight of a bumblebee or the way light hits a drop of dew. It was during this period of displacement that Leonardo's story took its darkest turn. Driven by a desperate need for survival and perhaps a growing cynicism about the world of men, he entered the service of a monster. Cesare Borgia, the inspiration for Machiavelli's The Prince, was a man who carved his way through Italy with blood and betrayal. He was a warlord who strangled his rivals and slaughtered entire towns to make a point. And for nearly a year, Leonardo da Vinci was his chief military engineer. Imagine the man who had written in his notebooks that war was a beastly madness, now riding beside a cold-blooded killer. Leonardo wasn't painting Madonnas for Borgia. He was designing the dark side of the Renaissance. He created the first truly modern topographic maps, bird's-eye views of cities that allowed Borgia to plan his sieges with the cold efficiency of a god. He designed fortifications that could withstand the very cannons he had once imagined. He was a man of peace, providing the tools for a tyrant to turn Italy into a graveyard. This was the great internal conflict of Leonardo's life. He loved the mechanics of the world so much that he couldn't stop himself from perfecting them, even when those mechanics were designed for death. But Borgia's world was too violent even for Leonardo. He eventually fled, returning to Florence, the city that had once imprisoned him. But the Florence he returned to was no longer his. A new star had risen, a young, brooding, and aggressive sculptor named Michelangelo. If Leonardo was the graceful courtier who smelled of lavender and spoke in riddles, Michelangelo was the grit beneath the city's fingernails. He was 20 years younger, covered in marble dust, and he hated Leonardo with a visceral intensity. To Michelangelo, Leonardo was an overdressed, flamboyant dandy who talked too much and finished too little. The city council decided to pit the two giants against each other in a public duel of genius. They were commissioned to paint two massive battle scenes on opposite walls of the great council hall. It was the Clash of the Titans. Leonardo, obsessed as always with pushing the boundaries, refused to use traditional fresco techniques. He wanted the colors to be richer, deeper, more alive. He experimented with a mixture of wax and oil, and to dry the massive wall, he brought in giant charcoal braziers. The result was a disaster. that would haunt his final years. As the heat rose, the experimental paint didn't dry. It began to melt. In front of the leaders of Florence and his mocking rival, Leonardo watched as the faces of the soldiers he had painstakingly painted began to run down the wall like colored tears. The masterpiece was liquefying before his eyes. The Battle of Anghiari, intended to be his greatest triumph, became a smudged, ruined ghost. He walked away from the hall, the laughter of the Florentine elite ringing in his ears. He retreated into his studio, locking the door against a world that he felt had finally broken him. It was in this period of profound failure and isolation that he began a small portrait of a silk merchant's wife. To any other artist, it was a minor commission to pay the bills. But to Leonardo, it became an obsession that he would carry for the rest of his life. He didn't just paint her face. He painted the soul he had been searching for in the morgues of Milan. He painted the Monalisa, but he refused to give it to the man who paid for it. He kept it. He traveled with it. He tweaked a single brushstroke for 20 years, trying to capture the exact, impossible geometry of a smile. It was the ultimate symbol of his failure, a painting he could never finish because his mind could never find the limit of its own perfection. As he entered his 60s, his body began to fail him. His right hand grew stiff, the victim of a stroke. He watched as his young rivals, Michelangelo and the rising Raphael, won the great commissions in Rome. Leonardo, the man who had been the sun, was now a fading moon. He sat in the twilight of his life, looking at his thousands of pages of notes. Notes on flying machines, the circulation of the blood, the anatomy of the eye. He realized that not one of his scientific discoveries had been published. Not one of his great machines had been built. To the eyes of the 16th century, Leonardo da Vinci was an old man who had spent his life chasing shadows. He wrote in his notebook, the handwriting shaky and reversed. "Tell me if anything was ever done. Tell me if anything was ever done." He felt the weight of a life spent in the future, while living in a present that wasn't ready for him. But just as the darkness was closing in, a letter arrived from the King of France. Francis I didn't want a military engineer or a fresco that wouldn't melt. He wanted something much more profound. He wanted to spend his days in the presence of a man who knew the secrets of the world. Leonardo didn't arrive in France as a servant. He arrived as a king without a crown. King Francis I gave him the chateau of Clos-Lucé, and, more importantly, he gave him the freedom to simply think. Legend says the king had an underground tunnel built between his own castle and Leonardo's house, just so he could walk over at any hour and listen to the old man speak. Francis didn't care about finished paintings. He looked at Leonardo and saw the personification of human potential. He called him mon père, my father. For the first time in his 70-year journey, the bastard of Vinci was truly home. But even as his body began to wither, Leonardo's mind remained a hurricane. He couldn't paint much with his clawed right hand, but he could still draw with his left, and his notebooks from these final years are the most haunting of all. He stopped looking at the anatomy of humans and started looking at the anatomy of the world. He became obsessed with the deluge, the idea of a great, world-ending flood. He filled page after page with swirling vortices of water and wind, terrifyingly beautiful images of a nature that was indifferent to the puny ambitions of man. He was a man who had spent his life trying to master the earth, and in the end, he realized the earth was a wild, untamable thing. On May 2nd, 1519, the light in the window of Clos-Lucé finally flickered out. History tells us that Leonardo da Vinci died in the arms of King Francis I, the king cradling the head of the genius as he took his final breath. It is a cinematic image, the most powerful man in Europe, weeping for the most brilliant man who ever lived. But as the room went cold, Leonardo left behind a tragedy that would take 5 centuries to uncover. He left over 7,000 pages of notebooks, a library of the future. But they weren't organized. They weren't published. They were written in his cryptic mirror script and scattered to the winds by his heirs. For hundreds of years, these pages sat in dusty trunks and private basements. Had they been published when he died, the history of the world would be unrecognizable. If the world had seen his drawings of the heart, medicine would have advanced 300 years in a single generation. If the world had understood his maps of the moon and his theories on the Earth's crust, the scientific revolution would have happened while the Middle Ages were still a living memory. He had designed a helicopter, a tank, a parachute, and a diving suit, centuries before the technology existed to build them. He had even glimpsed the theory of evolution and the laws of gravity long before Darwin or Newton were born. Leonardo da Vinci was a man who lived his entire life in a room where the doors were locked from the outside. He was shouting the secrets of the universe, but the world wasn't yet ready to hear the language he was speaking. He was buried in a small chapel in France, but even in death, he remained a mystery. During the chaos of the French Revolution, his grave was desecrated, his bones scattered and mixed with others. The physical man was erased, as if nature itself wanted to reclaim the body that had pried so many of its secrets away. But Leonardo didn't need a tombstone. He lives in the liquid eyes of the Monalisa. He lives in the blueprint of every machine that takes flight. He lives in the heart of every person who looks at a bird and asks, "How?" And every artist who looks at a shadow and asks, "Why?" He was the universal man, a man who proved that there is no boundary between the heart and the mind, between the brush and the scalpel, between the dream and the reality. He spent his life terrified that he had done nothing, but in truth, he had done everything. He had taught humanity that the greatest tool we possess isn't the sword or the crown, but the simple, relentless power of curiosity. As the sun sets over the hills of Vinci today, the hawk still circles in the thermals, and the water still swirls around the stones in the Arno. The world remains a puzzle of infinite complexity, just as it was 500 years ago. But because Leonardo walked among us, we now have the courage to try and solve it. He was a man who knew that life is short, but the search for truth is eternal. And in the silence of his final notebook, beneath a sketch of a geometric problem he was still trying to solve as death knocked at his door, he left us the ultimate lesson of a life well lived. As a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so a life well spent brings happy death.